Hi, thank you for joining us today. My name is Matthew Weil. I'm the Associate Director of the Democracy Project here at BPC, and I'm with John Fortier, who is the Director of the Democracy Project. The Democracy Project, just very briefly, focuses on Congress and institutions in government, and especially in even numbered years, we focus on elections. So today, we're going to discuss, can the elections be rigged? John, you want to take that one?
Sure. Maybe just a little bit of background.
Sure.
We also work on elections, but we were specifically out of a commission that the president had appointed after the 2012 election, a commission that had a Republican and a Democratic chair. Bob Bauer, the Democratic lawyer, who was Obama's lawyer, and Ben Ginsberg, who was Mitt Romney's lawyer. Essentially, this group came up with some recommendations that both parties can agree on the way to improve our elections. Now getting to your question,
Yes.
Can the elections be rigged? Look, I think it is very hard to rig an election if one means by that there's going to be a mass flipping of many thousands and thousands of votes across the country. There are important election integrity issues in this country. There are questions about how messy the voter registration lists are, whether we can check people in and properly to places to make sure that the right people who are eligible to vote. Everybody wants to see those issues resolved. And importantly, we are a country that has many, many election jurisdictions. We don't have one policy nationwide. That makes it messy, but it also means that it is much harder to rig an election. Essentially, to change election results or to even affect anything, one has to go to a lot of different places around the country. The other thing I would stress is that sometimes people think that the voting machines that we have, that they vote on, are connected broadly to the internet. And that is not the case. There are some security issues, security debates we have about how those machines should work, but it is not true that somebody remotely could change many, many votes at one time. The people who worry about getting into those machines and affecting those machines are really thinking about doing it machine by machine with screwdrivers and spending a lot of time with those machines. And there are many, many security protocols that both election officials and the vendors that make those machines have to prevent that. So there are possibilities for some election integrity issues to arise, but the notion of a large-scale rigged election, I think, is very far-fetched. So let me turn to you. Since we mentioned we do work on some election administration issues, there are many things out there that we can improve in our election system. So focus particularly on our registration system. There's a lot in the voter registration world that is changing, I think changing for the good, and tell us a little bit about what some of the issues are.
Sure. So voter registration is, I think, a good story that most American voters should be very happy to hear. At this point, in 2016, more than 60% of the states offer voter registration online to their voters. And so voters can really trust that the system they're going to is a state-based system. They're not worried about a third party taking a paper registration and it has to get to the election official, but it's going directly into the system where it can be verified and added much more quickly. And there are benefits to this, both for the voter, the ease and convenience, and as we saw during the recent hurricane, it's less of a burden when those kind of things happen because people can do it from anywhere. But there's also clear benefits for administration, and there are cost savings too. We know that election officials across the country have to spend a lot of money hiring people to key in hundreds of thousands of registrations that come in last minute. We know that errors happen when you have to key in lots of registrations last minute. These kind of online systems certainly improve the accuracy and the integrity because those who are interacting with these systems have to be part of a DMV database as well. The other big benefit that we've seen, and it's been increasing very rapidly over the past 4 years since the Presidential Commission issued its report to the President back in 2014, is data sharing between states. We don't have one voter registration list in this country, and every state maintains their own. And until relatively recently, they didn't even share with each other. And so we know that we have bloated rolls in the sense that people who move, and we're a very mobile society, can end up in multiple state lists. And it can be very difficult to get off of the state list, even once you've moved. But these interstate programs, and there are 2 national ones, but there are many states just working together, are certainly improving the databases by making sure we are getting rid of some dead weight, but also, in some cases, seeking out some voters to make sure that they are registered. I guess, going back to you, one of the other issues that we've heard about constantly, and it's a big concern for a lot of voter advocates and for election officials on the ground, are election day lines. Everyone remembers back to 2012, where we saw 7-8 hour lines in Florida. Some of those were during early voting, some were on election day. How does BPC come at these issues, and what do we expect for this fall?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So first of all, remember that the president, after the 2012 election, really called attention to this issue. He said there have been some long lines in places, and we can really fix that. And that was the impetus for him going forward and appointing this commission, again, this very bipartisan commission. And that commission ultimately took on a lot of other issues, in part because lines are a symptom of other things. And if you fix many things within our system, fix the registration system, work on some of the technology issues, you're going to help with the line issue. So I think that was to his credit that he one, went ahead and identified this issue, and two, that appointed the commission the way he did. So when we looked at 2012, what did we know? First of all, there were some horrible lines in a few places, but it is not a problem that is everywhere. Really, less than 10% of people are voting are taking longer than half an hour in line. The lines are concentrated in some places, so the average voter does not have some issues. It's also concentrated in states. You mentioned Florida. Florida showed up in our broad survey work as the place that people said they waited the longest. States like Virginia and Maryland and South Carolina and the District of Columbia also showed up in the high category for some lines. But one thing we found out, that the commission went through a process where they talked to people, and there's no one solution to lines, but they set a standard that said, look, if voters are waiting more than 30 minutes in line, that's an issue that election officials should address. More resources should be put at it. We should find ways to mitigate those lines. Of course, there are sometimes very extraordinary events of power outages or broken machines or a huge set of buses showing up right at the start of election line where some of these things may exceed half an hour for a bit, but it certainly is a warning sign that election officials should wake up to and say, if the lines are longer than that, we should go ahead and mitigate them. But what we really found out from this process was that while we know some very general things about lines, we do not know very much in a very specific way about lines. What I just reported to you is statewide survey data. Voters saying, hundreds of voters in the state of Florida saying, I waited this many minutes. We don't know anything about where they waited, which counties, which precincts, what time they waited, and then ultimately why these specific lines were caused. We, as a project at the BPC, really following on the Commission's work, are trying to remedy that. And we have a couple of programs out there, some of them more academic in nature, where some research projects are going to measure with stopwatches how long parts of the process take, and we have a partnership with MIT on that. But more importantly, we are asking election officials in large places, in Chicago, in Cook County, in many counties in Florida, and most of the state of Virginia, and a lot of places across the country, to actually go and count how many people are standing in line at every polling place. That seems like a very simple thing, but for states to really make any progress on the line issue, to really diagnose what's wrong, to figure if they have enough resources, they need to know this information. And so we are trying to establish that there'll be a practice for election officials to really just count how many people in line at every polling station. We can translate that into minute waits. We can do all sorts of things with that. But when we have that information, we hope after this election, the beginning of that, we're going to know a lot more about lines and really going to be able to affect them.
So I guess to follow up on that, what do we expect to learn, and what can voters expect 4 years from now in 2020 based on the research we're doing this year?
Well, one thing we suspect is that some of this is a capacity problem. There are some places that, of course, have lines because of a sudden event, but there are some places that have lines year after year. And the Commission did try to develop some tools that are available online at the website of supportthevoter.gov that officials can use to estimate, well, do they have enough voting machines? Do they have enough check-in stations, enough people at the polling place to handle the volume? But I think that's at the early stages of diagnosis. And I think this information we get is really going to tell us, is it some places really just don't have, they have too many voters for the number of machines they have. Are there some problems at times of the day, in the morning? Are there some particular problems we need to get a handle on? So we found, even in our experiments, that the jurisdictions that use this find that they are learning things about their own polling places in their counties that they didn't know. That's the beginning of wisdom for them, the beginning of the ability to diagnose these things. And so I hope in 4 years we'll know a lot more lines will be mitigated, and as we go forward it will become a universal practice where everybody will say, of course we want to know what's going on, lines as they come up, because we want to deal with them as quickly as we can.
I'll note that this program is in jurisdictions across the country, I think over 200 counties at this point, and covering 40 million registered voters, so a large chunk of the country. Just one final question before we go, because you've written a book about this, but we've seen very large increases in voting before Election Day. We're talking about lines on Election Day, but there are obviously early voting lines. A lot of voters are using vote by mail. What do you expect to see this year with percentages of voting before Election Day? And do you think this trend is going to continue, or do you think it'll kind of top out before 2020?
I think we've seen a trend really has gained momentum since the 1980s of more people voting before Election Day. That means some people voting by mail, absentee ballot. In fact, some states like Washington and Oregon really now voting 100% by mail without polling places. But also places that have put in early voting sites in polling places, 1, 2, 3 weeks before the election. If one looked historically before the 1980s, you would have seen maybe 5% of voters voted this way. They were people who were out of town on business or had long-term health problems, and they often had to provide a reason and go through some hoops to get an absentee ballot. That changed a lot with the western states opening up the absentee ballot process, making it easier to cast one, with other states like Tennessee and Texas beginning to open up their polling places earlier. It was up to 14% by 1980. We think we're going to see close to 40% of voters vote either by mail or early voting centers this year in 2016. And that has implications, sure, for the polling place on Election Day. Some of those people may vote earlier and take off some of the pressure on Election Day, but it also does confuse things a bit. Jurisdictions have to run several elections now, either by mail, early, Election Day, and they're not always sure who's going to show up when. Is there going to be a surge at early voting? Is there going to be a surge at one day? Is there going to be more mail? The campaigns often push one or the other. And so instead of knowing that there are X number of voters coming to this polling place on Election Day, election administrators are really having to think about and estimate where the surge is going to be. So it makes their job easier in one way by spreading out the election, but also they have to forecast much better about where these voters are. So generally, it can be a positive development, but there are some challenges associated with it.
Well, that's all we have today. You can learn a lot more about what work we're doing, including finding reports about Election Day command centers, about voting by mail, and you can find links to the Presidential Commission's report on BPC's website at bipartisanpolicy.org.